Okay, welcome back. So just to reiterate, we were looking at the 5 pillars of Islam. And so these are the 5 most fundamental things to Islamic belief and Islamic life. And so we've got the declaration of belief, or being able to believe in those things, that there is one God and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Number 2, we've got the daily prayers, which if you think about the way, if in your community everybody's doing those prayers, that's definitely going to get people on the same page and have a very similar schedule, a very similar life experience. Number 3 is taking care of people through charity, giving your income to the poor and those in need. So the idea of being good to people is right there. It's very fundamental. And then you've got fasting during the month of Ramadan, a sort of celebration that brings people together through sort of a deliberate kind of discipline. You can't eat during the day, so you can only eat at night. And then you've got the pilgrimage, which literally brings people together, all together to visit the holy city and to be there. And I've heard a lot of Muslims describe it as, one of the most important events in their lives, being able to go and travel there and be part of that history. So these are all different ways of sort of bringing a community together around the same sort of ideas and practices. And the city of Mecca has the holy shrine of the Kaaba. So the Kaaba was originally a place where the polytheistic religion of Arabia was practiced. Muhammad calls them idols. Like Judaism, Islam doesn't really have much comfort with other people, having sort of pagan polytheistic gods. And so Muhammad purified the shrine and removed the idols and made it into the center of Islam instead. And so this is the holy site where the pilgrimage goes, and you can see all the people gathered for their pilgrimage. I recently saw a picture of, for the first time, nobody being there currently. The pilgrimage is usually done in the same month altogether, but there are always, a constant stream of visitors going to see it, except right now. So it's pretty wild to see the holy shrine, the Kaaba, without any people around it. But the Kaaba contains a sacred black stone that's part of the altar, and it's said to be the altar that Adam and Eve worshipped God at. And it is also said to be a rock that fell from heaven. So it's possibly a meteorite. And it has been partially worn away because all the pilgrims come through the shrine and touch it over the years. But it's still an important thing for people to be able to interact with. And so the Kaaba is a symbol of that relationship to God. And yeah, here's that mosque, the sacred mosque that contains the Kaaba. Look at all those people coming for the pilgrimage. It's pretty wild. You get a good sense of Muslim architecture as well, which we'll talk about in a minute here. So let's more about the Quran. So the Quran is the holy book of Islam, and it is a record of God's message to Muhammad. And so it is literally means the recitation, or something that Muhammad memorized and then told to others. So the thing that Gabriel said to Muhammad was speak, recite, be able to say the message of God. So it's fundamental that the message of God starts as an oral message conveyed to Muhammad. And so even though it's written down, it's still something that being able to speak it and to memorize it is very important, and something that a lot of people do when they study the text. And it's said in some accounts that Muhammad was either illiterate or just not a very schooled writer. He wasn't very trained in writing. So it makes him more of a true prophet because he was closer to the source. He wasn't about sort of writing a book. He was more about learning and memorizing a message. And if you do read the message, it's better to read it in its original language, which is the Arabic of that time, which is a bit, more complicated and more confusing than the Arabic of today. But people consider it very worthwhile to learn it because any translation will have inaccuracies. You've got to change something at least a little bit when you translate it. So to really get close to God, the most important thing is to read it in its original form. And you can read a translated version, but that won't get you as close as you want to be to God. And so some of the important ideas in the Quran are monotheism, that God has a plan for everybody, this perfect sort of design, and that you should do X, Y, and Z things to be a good person, be kind to others, and take care of people. And so there's a sort of idea of a law of how one should live. And some of that is in the Quran. But as we're going to see here, it's not all in the Quran. It's also stuff that's been developed later by Muslim scholars over the centuries. So the Quran is the most fundamental stuff. If it's in the Quran, you better remember it and obey it. So other ideas that sometimes get confused with the Quran. One of them is hadith. Hadith are reports, ideas about the life of Muhammad, sort of accounts of things that Muhammad said or did, and they are very sort of there are a variety of different traditions about Muhammad that help to interpret the Quran and add more detail where the Quran doesn't talk about certain subjects. And so a large part of what Muslim scholars do is they evaluate these hadith and they decide whether they're authentic, plausible, or inauthentic. And so they decide which ones people should listen to. And, various accounts of the way to live. So, Muhammad grew his beard to this length. Should that be the length that people should grow their beards? And so you listen and you decide if that's plausible or if you think that it was a different beard length, actually. And so people use these different accounts, and so there can be, in different Muslim countries and different parts of the world, there can be different versions of these accounts and different interpretations of the right way to live. So there's a lot of variety, even though there's the Quran, which is sort of the central text for everyone. There's a lot of variety in what people put into practice. And then you have Sharia, which just means the law. You might have heard the phrase Sharia law. Technically, that's redundant. But Sharia is a law code that tries to interpret the teachings of the Quran and put them into practice. We said that Islam is tied to the government more than other religions are. And Sharia can be interpreted pretty broadly. Anything that you get from the Hadith, anything that you think will sort of help uphold the principles of the Quran, especially justice, all of those can be part of Sharia. So there are many versions of Sharia, many versions of the law, and not just one. So there's different Sharia in different parts of the Muslim world, in Iran versus Iraq versus Indonesia, all sorts of different ways of doing things. But they do have a lot in common. But I think it's important to remember that a lot of it is based on sort of debate and argument, and not just what's in the Quran. And a lot of things people think are in the Quran are actually part of the Hadith, and may vary from country to country. Okay, you might have also heard the term fatwa. Fatwa just means an authoritative opinion from a legal scholar, from an expert in Sharia. And an expert in Sharia and in the Muslim text is known as a mullah. So a mullah can issue a fatwa. It's not a legal, it's not like a law, but a fatwa can be an opinion which a lot of other people might listen to and follow. So again, yeah, different groups have different practices and different things that they value. The most important thing is the Quran. That's more important than any of these. You might have also heard of the term jihad. Jihad just means struggle. Like a sports competition could be a jihad, or, getting your homework done could be a jihad, is something I've heard some Muslim students refer to. Jihad doesn't mean holy war. That would be one interpretation of the idea of a struggle. But it could be a struggle to do any particular thing. And some people say the greater jihad is the struggle against oneself. And the idea of a holy war is only a lesser jihad. The most important thing is to sort of learn to be a good person and to control oneself and to be right with God. Some other ideas. You might have heard that there's a tendency to avoid making images in Islam. And this is actually another idea that's up for debate. Some people think that in Islam, you shouldn't ever make any images at all. Don't draw any pictures, don't paint any pictures. Other people think it's fine if you do that for secular reasons. Just don't do that of Muhammad. So don't make images of Muhammad. Don't make images of the most important people in religion, and don't make images of God, things like that, because you can't make an image of God because your image will be inaccurate. And only God can really make the images in the world. That'd be another interpretation. Other Muslims have thought it's actually perfectly fine to make images of Muhammad. You just have to do it in a secular context and not worship them. Basically, the most important thing is not to worship an image, because God is not, a statue, which is a very big difference from, polytheistic religion like we saw in Mesopotamia. They love making statues of gods, not in Islam and not in a lot of more conservative versions of Judaism as well. Yeah. In Islam. So this is something there's a lot of discussion and debate, sometimes very intense debate over in Islam. I think the fundamental thing to remember is that the Quran actually really is in many ways more progressive than other texts at the time would have been about women, about gender. The Quran indicates this strong respect for women and that women have rights. Women shouldn't be trampled on by men or abused by men or harmed by men. But there's also a very much separate but equal thing going on. There's a strong idea of social roles for men and women, that men and women can and should play different roles, while at the same time saying that women are very important and should not be harmed by men. And the original context of all this is somewhat different than we would think today, that in the Arabian tribes, there was the practice of polygyny, which is men marrying multiple women. It didn't work the other way around, but one man could be married to multiple women. And Muhammad's first wife, his most important wife, seems to be a very powerful and respected figure. Her name was Khadija, and she was said to be the first convert to Islam, and highly praised by him as a sort of holy and respected woman. She is sometimes called the mother of believers. And it seems like in Arabic society, women were very much associated with trade and with being merchants. So while they were restricted in some ways, for instance, they weren't supposed to go out of the home very often because it was feared that men would abduct them or seduce them or something like that. Women could own property, which is not something that was true in early ancient Greece, for instance. And women could make a lot of financial deals. So while they didn't have power in some ways, they had a lot of power in other ways. And then the various practices of covering, whether that's head covering or whole body covering, they seem to date back to earlier Arab practices and not just be a unique feature of Islam. In Islam, they sometimes seem to be doing that, sometimes seems to be a self-affirming act, that when you're concerned about men, covering yourself can be a way to kind of take yourself off the market, take yourself out of their vision, and so not have to worry about men interfering with you and being and causing you a hard time. That's the way it's interpreted in sort of certain varieties of Islam, and it's something to think about. So I think at the time a lot of women saw it as a way to get away from men. There's still debate on this practice today, but you could see that as one way of doing things. And a lot of the ideas, there are some Islamic countries that are more conservative and there are some that are more progressive. And a lot of what people think is just inherent in the Quran is actually something that's coming from the Hadith, from these different perspectives in these different parts of the world. So different versions of the law. One thing that's very important to mention is that divorce was allowed. So if women are able to divorce men, they have a lot more power. And the reasons they had to give a reason to divorce men, though: abuse, neglect, or interestingly, financial failure. So if the guy goes bankrupt, that he makes a bad deal, then you can divorce him, which shows that women were associated with merchant type stuff. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right. See you guys in the next video.